what a Jewish state has done in the name of the Jewish people. Israel had done bad things before, very, I think, serious crimes, but this is just the most monstrous thing that has happened in my lifetime. Most of the buildings are destroyed. Most of the hospitals are destroyed. Most of the schools, most of the universities, most of the agriculture is destroyed. A place that was declared unlivable by the United Nations before October 7th has now been destroyed to an extent that, it's hard to even find the words.
The Palestinians have been offered a state on relatively generous terms on more than one occasion, and they've said no. Hamas has embedded itself in the civilian population in such a way that extirpating it as a military threat is not doable without significant civilian damage. There are examples in history of conflict between nations in which horrific crimes have been committed, and we now celebrate them on Victory over Japan Day. That's an actual holiday. They could have surrendered. And had they done, they would have spared themselves a lot of this misery.
The truth is, if you look at the history of negotiation, the Israelis and the Palestinians were always in a different place. They had different understandings of what the Palestinian state was going to look like. Israel's always wanted to annex more of the West Bank than the Palestinians were prepared to concede. Israel's wanted to maintain control of the Jordan Valley, and the Palestinians are like, this is not a sovereign state if you have troops on our soil. The Palestinians have wanted some refugee return. Israel has generally not wanted all. It's like me wanting to buy your house, and I'll pay you $500,000 and you're willing to sell me $1 million. You've rejected my offer, but Israel also rejected the Palestinians' offer.
Hello, everybody. This is Glenn Loury. You've tuned in or are listening to The Glenn Show. I'm joined this week by Peter Beinart, who's a professor of journalism and political science at the City University, New York, an editor-at-large for Jewish Currents magazine, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
We are here to discuss your new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Congratulations on the book, Peter. I think it's a wonderful contribution to this vitally important conversation.
I appreciate that.
And as I was saying before we started on reading it, I had the eerie feeling that I was eavesdropping on a family feud as my Jewish friends fight among each other about the significance of what's gone on since October 7th and before. It must have been very difficult to take the stand that you're taking amidst all of this controversy, to the consternation, I imagine, of many dear friends and loved ones and so on.
Yeah, I always feel uncomfortable, knowing how to respond to that question, because I feel like the first thing that I have to say is that, I live on the Upper West Side of New York. I'm a tenured professor. I've got enough food in my fridge. I've got there's so many people, even in the United States, let alone Gaza, who don't have any of those things, right? So my problems are, pretty easy compared to those people's problems. It's definitely true that the book and my writing, even before the book, has strained and even ruptured some relationships that were important to me. And that's been painful. And I sometimes feel harder for my family than me, because I kind of went on, I made the decision to do this, right? But they kind of get the collateral damage, of being associated with me, even though they didn't necessarily ask for it. But I also feel I feel like it's led to a whole series of other relationships. I mean, when I grew up, and even in my days, when we used to know each other a little bit through the Republic, I didn't have relationships with Palestinians, and those relationships have been those people have been that's enriched my life so much. I've learned so much. And I feel like even though sometimes my relationship in the organized Jewish community is more perilous, I feel like I now have other communities that are really gratifying to me.
You say it's a reckoning. You say somewhere in the book that you think this is a watershed moment in Jewish history. Do you want to explain that? A reckoning about what?
A reckoning about what a Jewish state has done in the name of the Jewish people, because it is a state that speaks in the name of the Jewish people. And I think what it is, Israel had done bad things before, very, I think, serious crimes. But this is just the most monstrous thing that has happened in my lifetime. I mean, we don't have to get hung up on the phrase genocide, but even just put that aside. Just describe what's actually happened to this place, right? Most of the buildings are destroyed. Most of the hospitals are destroyed. Most of the schools, most of the universities, most of the agriculture is destroyed. A place that was considered, that had been declared unlivable by the United Nations before October 7th, has now been destroyed to an extent that, like, it's hard to even find the words. I mean, you talk to people from Gaza, they've been dislocated from their homes or their tents 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. I was talking to a woman in LA. I just happened to be there earlier this week. She thinks that she may have lost 150 family members since October 7th. People stopped counting, and so this, to me, and I look at this community, I live in the Jewish community. My life is structured by Jewish ritual, by Jewish calendar, by Jewish institutions. These are the people that I consider kind of like my family. And I look around and I'm thinking, are people not seeing what I'm seeing? Because what I'm seeing fills me with horror every day. And how is it that these people who I care about and are good people in so many aspects of their lives, how can they seem to be okay with this? And that was really what led me to write the book, to try to answer that question.
How can they? I must confess, often asked myself. And when I have given even mild voice to an assessment of what's been perpetrated here at the Glenn Show, I've gotten a ton of negative pushback from a lot of people with real consequence for the health of my platform, which is just the way it is. And I'm not complaining. I'm just observing. I'm observing. And I wonder, I mean, you're Jewish and I am not. Where a person like myself is supposed to stand in this conflict without either bringing down on themselves a suspicion of their motives or really meddling in something that in a way is not my business, though I want to say as an American, it's very much my business.
And as a human being, it's your business. This is what drives, first of all, was so excited to do your show, partly because I know that there are a lot of Jews who love you, who don't like me. And so I may get to be able to speak to them through your show in a way that I couldn't otherwise. And so this book is written to people in my community who profoundly disagree with me. And I'm so grateful when people listen. I love this line from Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah, which says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." But it drives me crazy, Glenn, that those people would make you feel like you didn't have the right, even the obligation, to speak your mind about this, because this is one of the things that you have stood for so many years, is the idea that identity claims should not be barriers to people being able to state their truth, right? That you don't have to have a particular kind of background, whatever it is, in order to make a contribution to a conversation, and that you should be welcome to that conversation and considered innocent of bigotry until proven guilty. That's something that I have heard from you. And those people, many of those Jewish friends, I would suspect, they really like it when you say that vis-a-vis Black people, because they like the idea that as Jews who are considered white or whatever, they can have an opinion about affirmative action or DEI or whatever. So apply in that, if you believe in that principle, then someone like you or anyone who's not Jewish should be able to come forward and say, as an American, as a human being, here's my analysis. You can argue with me. I have the right to make an analysis. And I think that it's part of the reason I wrote this book. One reason is I want to use whatever unearned privilege I have as a Jewish person, because being Jewish doesn't mean you know anything about this subject. It just means you happen to be Jewish, right? I want to use that privilege in order to try to create space, if I can, for people like you, because I think we'd have a much healthier conversation about Israel and Palestine if people weren't so terrified always of being called anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I didn't solicit it, or maybe I did. I don't know.
No, you didn't. I feel very strongly about this.
We didn't conspire before the program for you to say this that much. Stories Jewish people tell themselves that blind them to Palestinian suffering. That's one of the reasons why you wrote the book, you say,
Yes.
in the liner notes. What about that?
I think that there's a discourse that exists in the Jewish community in the United States and beyond, in much of the world, in which Jews are imagined as kind of history's permanent virtuous victims. Um, and so whatever happens in Israel-Palestine tends to get put into that framework. So I write about Jewish holidays and the way that those holidays get narrated often in Jewish kind of popular discourse. According to this joke, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. And my point is actually the stories of our holidays are actually a lot more complicated than that. They're not just stories of victimization and survival. They're often stories of Jewish victimization of others. The Hebrew Bible speaks about Jews in a whole range, or that's anachronistic. In some ways, you're talking about Israelites in a whole range of different ways, not just as victims. But the story, so the book of Esther, which we're about to read next month on the holiday of Purim, is not just a story of an attempted genocide against Jews. It ends with a Jewish massacre of the adversaries of the Jews. And yet that 9th chapter of the book of Esther is so rarely, I find, focused on when Jews think about the holiday. And so this then becomes the way in which people narrate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict too, is if the Palestinians are just this reincarnation of the Cossacks of the Russian Empire or the Nazis or some other group of anti-Semites, because in some trans-historical way, Jews are always in the role of permanent virtuous victim.
Well, there was October 7th.
Indeed. And
yes. And there were the rockets.
Yes.
And there's Hezbollah. Yes. And there's Iran.
Absolutely.
So this destruction that we both lament perhaps is the necessary and imperative response to the existential threat that's posed by these anti-Jewish forces.
Right.
Etc.
So that would be the counter argument. Right. And I don't, and I think anyone who reads the book, I think in good faith would be very hard pressed to say that I minimize the horror of October 7th. Indeed, I start the 2nd chapter with a long series of stories about what happened to different individual Israeli Jews on October 7th, and also the way in which the trauma of Israeli society, which goes back to the Holocaust, was reawakened by October 7th. October 7th was one of the bleakest days of my entire life. We have still the names of the hostages on our refrigerator, and we mark them off as God willing, they come out alive or they don't come out alive. But so to me, I'm not minimizing in any way the horror of what October 7th was and what Hamas did, which I believe were war crimes for which they should be held responsible, or for that matter, Hezbollah rocket attacks. But to me, the critical question is, what is the context in which one understands this violence? Not to justify it, but to understand it so you can respond in a way that hopefully makes everybody safer. And to me, to understand it, one has to understand the legal realities that exist in Israel-Palestine. The legal reality that exists in Israel-Palestine is that every Jew who lives in Israel has full citizenship, lives under civil law, has free movement, and the right to vote for the government. Most of the Palestinians under Israeli control do not have any of those rights. There is a minority, sometimes called Arab Israelis, that have a kind of second-class citizenship. They can vote, but they suffer structural discrimination. But most of the Palestinians under Israeli control in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem don't have any citizenship, right? They can't be citizens of the state. They can't vote for the government. They live under military law, or in the West Bank, they live under blockade. And people say Israel doesn't really control Gaza. Well, first of all, certainly, sure as heck controls Gaza now. But even before October 7th, Israel controlled the population registry. If you wanted to go in and out of Gaza, a person, send a good in and out of Gaza, it had to be approved by the Israeli government. That's why Human Rights Watch called it an open-air prison. The guards weren't inside the prison, but they controlled the perimeter. And so to me, if one understands this terrible violence, you have to understand it in that context. And calling it a pogrom or comparing it to the Nazis imagines a completely different context, a context in which Jews are legally inferior. This was an act of terrible violence against Jews under conditions of Jewish legal supremacy. And it seems if you don't understand that, then you're not going to have a good analysis of what happened and try to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
You're blaming the Jews for the hatred that animates their enemies?
I think that the hatred that, and I say this as someone who knows many, many, many Palestinians and reads a lot of Palestinian writing and engages with Palestinians, I would dare say a lot more than most of my Jewish critics. The vast majority of Palestinian hatred for Israel and for Zionism, I think, is of the same kind of character that Black South Africans felt for the system of apartheid, that Catholics felt for Protestant domination, that Black Americans felt for segregation and slavery. It is not some pathological, irrational, trans-historical hatred of Jews because they are Jews. It's a hatred of a system of oppression, right? And it doesn't mean these people are saints. They're certainly not any more saintly than any other group of people. It doesn't mean they can't do terrible things. Hamas has done terrible things. But to me, that's the structure in which we need to understand Palestinian politics, because it's not so different than the politics of any group of people that is denied basic freedom.
You say that the destruction that's been wrought in Gaza is almost unspeakable. Wasn't it necessary for the purpose of ridding the Israelis of the threat that Hamas poses on their border? And even if we grant your context arguments about their behavior having an explanation, the just sheer fact of it required a response. What would you have had Israel do, but for other than what it has and what it has done?
Yeah, well, I will answer that question. I think it's just worth noting that Hamas is still there, right? So on its own terms, Netanyahu said this war is going to get back the hostages, right? Israel has rescued very few hostages militarily. It's killed more hostages in its military campaign than it's rescued. The hostages who've gotten out, those who've gotten out, thank God, because of ceasefire. And Hamas is still there. I mean, you see Hamas parading around Gaza now, right? It's true. A lot of their fighters were killed and a lot of their weapons were destroyed. But you know what? They can find a lot more fighters, because you know how they recruit? They go to the families of the people Israel has killed and they recruit more fighters. And they'll find creative ways of getting new weaponry. In fact, one of the ways they get new weapons is they take Israel's weapons or the shards of Israel's weapons, they rebuild them, which is just what the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese did when we were fighting them, right? So in its own terms, it seems to me this has failed. To me, the problem is a political problem. The problem is that you are living cheek by jowl with people who you're denying their freedom, and they're going to fight you, right? Because that's what people do. And the early Zionists were much more honest about this. Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, Netanyahu's own tradition, he compared the Palestinians to Native Americans. He said, we're like the Pilgrims. Of course they're going to fight us. We're like Cortez and the Pilgrims. We have to win, he said. But he didn't think there was anything pathological. He thought they were responding in a natural way. So to me, the question is, first of all, how do you incentivize Palestinians to struggle for freedom in a humane and ethical way? In a way that doesn't take the lives of any Israeli Jews, because Israeli Jewish life is infinitely precious, just like Palestinian life is precious. And that seems to me that when Palestinians struggle nonviolently and in ways that are consistent with international law, we need to support that, at least not repress it. Because what drives me crazy, Glenn, is the very same people who were most horrified by October 7th, as they should be. What do they do when the Palestinians do nonviolent marches, like the March of Return, or when Palestinians try to go to the UN or the International Criminal Court, or do boycotts and sanctions? They don't say, good for you. You're responding nonviolently in the tradition of Martin Luther King. God, you know what they do? They try to criminalize those efforts or sanction the International Criminal Court, which actually strengthens Hamas. I have a friend in Gaza who's told me about his conversations with Hamas members. And the Hamas members say to him, none of your efforts have worked. So let us try it our way. I think the response to October 7th should have been, look, if Israel wanted to do military actions against the Hamas leadership and the people who planned those attacks, I'm not going to mourn for those people. But you shouldn't punish an entire population. What you should do is recognize that Palestinians need a horizon for their freedom. And you should have started to take actions that would allow Palestinians to be able to have some hope that they could have basic freedom. I would have let Marwan Barghouti out of jail. He's the most popular Palestinian leader. He's not an Islamist. He's much more popular than Hamas. He's often talked about as the Palestinian Mandela. I would have withdrawn some of these settlements from deep in the West Bank that make life hell for Palestinians. I would have committed to say, we support a Palestinian state, or we support the idea that Palestinians should have equality in Israel. I would have done things to give Palestinians hope, because I actually really believe that it is Palestinian hope that is intimately connected with Israeli Jewish safety.
I'm rehearsing the counter arguments because there is no one here to do it other than me.
Okay, I got it.
The Palestinians have been offered a state on relatively generous terms on more than one occasion, and they've said no. Hamas has embedded itself in the civilian population in such a way that extirpating it as a military threat is not doable without significant civilian damage. There are examples in history of conflict between nations in which horrific crimes, quote unquote, crimes have been committed. And we now celebrate them on Victory over Japan Day. That's an actual holiday here in the state of Rhode Island, and remembering Normandy and all of that.
Yeah, yeah.
They could have surrendered.
Right.
I can remember your old boss, Marty Peretz, writing in the New Republic years ago, the Palestinians are a defeated people. What are you talking about resistance? They could have surrendered. And had they done, they would have spared themselves a lot of this misery. Human shields, did I say that already?
Yeah. Well, okay, so there's a lot of those, and I'm happy to go through them one by one. I'll try not to be too long about it. Under international law, just because you believe there are armed fighters in an area doesn't mean you don't have a legal responsibility for the civilians that are there. It doesn't abrogate your responsibility. If you were allowed under international law to blow up an apartment building because there's some Hamas fighters there, or even some Hamas generals there, then what would you say if Hamas decided that it wanted to blow up an apartment building in Tel Aviv because there were some Israeli generals living there? Because the truth is that the Israeli military infrastructure is not sequestered away from civilian populations in Israel. It's throughout civilian Israel. The Kiryat, Israel's military headquarters, is not in some remote location. It's in downtown Tel Aviv. For my book, I actually calculated how many schools there are within about 1.5 kilometers of Israel's military headquarters. Does that mean you have the right to blow up those schools because you're going to destroy Israel's military headquarters? No, that's a blatant violation of international law. And you know who else uses this human shields argument? The Russians, when they attack civilian infrastructure. One of the first things the Russians did when they attacked Kiev, they said the Ukrainian military is in the city and they're responsible because they are making the population human shields. Every military that destroys civilian infrastructure, the U.S. said it about Vietnam because the Viet Cong had developed this infrastructure of tunnels. The Saudis said it in Yemen. The Jewish community doesn't give those arguments the time of day, except when we're looking for a justification because we don't want to have to face the fact that we've destroyed most of the hospitals. And for goodness sakes, for the universities, right? We would never for a minute take seriously Russia's justifications for destroying most of Ukraine's universities and hospitals, right? People are looking for alibis, right? On this argument about they rejected every opportunity. The truth is that if you look, I don't want to be dismissive, but most of the people who make these arguments have never actually read any of the academic work that's been done about what we know about what happened in these negotiations. The truth is, if you look at the history of negotiation, the Israelis and the Palestinians were always in a different place. They had different understandings of what the Palestinian state was going to look like. Israel has always wanted to annex a lot more of the West Bank. If you think about 2000 with Barak, or 2007, 2008 with Omer, Israel has always wanted to annex more of the West Bank than the Palestinians were prepared to concede, because they felt that these Israeli annexations would leave them with a rump state that wasn't really contiguous. Israel's wanted to maintain control over the Jordan Valley, and the Palestinians are like, this is not a sovereign state if you have troops on our soil. The Palestinians have wanted some refugee return. Israel has generally not wanted all. There's been a debate about whether the Palestinians would have a capital in East Jerusalem or it's like me wanting to buy your house and I'll pay you $500,000 and you're willing to sell me $1 million. You've rejected my offer, but Israel also rejected the Palestinians' offer, right? Which was generally like something much closer to the 67 lines in a fully sovereign state. So that's what's left out of this. And in terms of Palestinian capitulation, and then I'll shut up. Look at what Mahmoud Abbas and particularly Salam Fayyad did. They actually tried. It's an astonishing thing. They tried a strategy of collaboration and appeasement. Nelson Mandela and Jerry Adams would have never thought this was, never would have done something like this. They said, we're going to work with the government, that's a state that's oppressing us, to prevent any armed resistance, to try to convince them that we can be trusted with our own country. And Salam Fayyad, you may remember, he was very popular in Israel and very popular among American Jews because he was the most moderate person they could ever imagine. And when he left Palestinian politics in 2013, he told the New York Times, I got nowhere. I didn't stop settlement growth for one day. And he said, Hamas will grow stronger from my failure because the Israel never supported me at all. So even when the Palestinians do the things that we ask the Palestinians to do, they don't get anywhere for
it. I want to talk about the one-state solution and the two-state solution because I get the impression reading you
yes,
that you would have it that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea and the territory that's effectively controlled by Israel now, every person would have equal political rights.
Yes.
And I gather from some of my Zionist friends that they consider that to be equivalent to wishing that the Jewish state no longer exists as a Jewish state.
They're right. It wouldn't exist as a Jewish state.
Well, a lot of Jewish people have a problem with that. I've been told that the right thing to say here is Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. I did note historically the amendment of having a right to exist to having a right to exist as a Jewish state.
Right.
Those things are different. Can you explain to the audience why it is that you take this, what I'm sure is an extremely unpopular position amongst your Jewish comrades?
It's strange, because this idea is considered not only radical, but actually, extremely offensive, right? The idea of a state that treats everybody equally, irrespective of their religion or ethnicity or race, right? I kind of thought that's what we believed in the United States. In fact, I think as far as I can tell, except for maybe some Trump people, that's what most American Jews believe in the United States. In fact, we believe it about every country except for Israel, right? Most Jews don't believe in the idea of Christian and Muslim and Jewish or Hindu states, right? We believe American Jews have done very well as America has gotten a little closer to the principle of equality under the law. And yet it's considered inconceivable there that you could have this principle, that in Israel, only Jewish supremacy, by which I mean Jews having legally superior rights to Palestinians, only that protects Jews. And yet the irony is that Israel is actually the most dangerous place for a Jewish person to be, more dangerous than any of these diaspora communities that are based on the principle of non-sectarian states where Jews live. And for me, the reason for this is actually like at a childlike level, it's pretty simple, right? When you give people a voice in government, they're less likely to use violence because they have non-violent mechanisms to make the government listen to them. So I think Israeli Jews are safer given that they're going to be living alongside Palestinians. Now, some Israeli Jews and Donald Trump might want to get rid of the Palestinians, but as long as the Palestinians, are there, the question is, do you want to live alongside people who are being brutally oppressed, or do you want to live alongside people who have a voice in government? The Palestinian citizens, the Arab Israelis, the minority of Palestinians who have a voice in government, it's amazing because Israeli Jews are a lot less afraid of them than they are of Palestinians in the West Bank. A lot of the doctors in Israel and nurses and pharmacists are Palestinian citizens. And Israelis go on the operating table with these people. Why are they so why? It's the same people. Why are those people less threatening to them than the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank? And I think it's because the Palestinian citizens have a voice in government. And that's my basic contention. On the question of right to exist, I think human beings have a right to exist. That's the way I read Jewish tradition. Abraham Joshua Heschel said, the only thing created in the image of God is the human being, every human being. So to me, states are mere instruments to protect human life. And if they do a really lousy job of it, then we reimagine the nature of the state.
Okay, I'm trying to put myself again in the position of a Zionist sympathetic Jewish person who would wonder what would happen. I mean, as a practical matter, come on, let's be real. You've seen these people and how they live. These people being the Gazans, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and and so on. You've seen what they do. We really want to make them, well, not the residents of Lebanon, but we really want to make them a part of our state. We've done something really important here. We've created a bastion in this region. Look at our technology, look at our arts and culture, look at the Nobel Prizes, look at the achievement that we've done. It's a garden that's blooming in the midst of a desert. There are many Arab Muslim states. There's only one Jewish state. We're going to gamble. We're going to gamble this achievement on the theory that you advance that if people had political rights, they wouldn't be so obstreperous. They are a genocidal, suicidal death cult. I mean, I'm quoting Douglas Murray or somebody here. This is a bastion of Western civilization on the outpost of the civilized world, and you want to throw that away based on a theory?
Right. So it's a theory. It's also a racist theory. I mean, let's be honest. It's a racist theory, and I think even in you rehearsing that, I think, I mean, I don't know if you were thinking that, but that's, when I, this is the way people tend to talk about populations that they oppress in order to justify why those people don't deserve the equality with them, because you basically describe them as barbarians. It's not just in this context. It happens all the time. The way that the story you were telling about Palestinians from, in this imagined kind of pro-Israel is very similar to the way that white South Africans talked about Black South Africans, that these people were, maybe one day they'd catch up and eventually they would deserve. But right now they're primitives. They can't be trusted, and they're violent and they're dangerous. And they have the whole rest of the African continent after all. And how good a job are they doing north of the Limpopo River? All those countries are dictatorships and basket cases. How could anyone possibly think that we, by the way, white South Africans are only 10% of the population. Israeli Jews are 50% of the population, and they didn't have the international network of alliances. They were much more vulnerable, right? How could we possibly allow a Black government to put ourselves at the mercy of this organization, the ANC, which is supported by getting its arms from the Soviet Union, considered a terrorist organization by the United States, not committed to nonviolence? The Protestants in Northern Ireland were terrified. Ian Paisley, the Protestant leader, called the Good Friday Agreement, which gave Catholics political equality, a prelude to genocide. The views that Protestants in Northern Ireland had of Catholics of Catholic Ireland, was not so different than the way white South Africans thought about Black South Africa, or the way that Jews talk about the Middle East. It's so funny. I constantly hear Israeli and American Jews talk about, you have to understand the rules of the Middle East. It's a dangerous neighborhood. I never hear Palestinians talk that way. It's not because Palestinians don't recognize that those governments are really terrible, but they don't have an essentialized racist view about Arabs and Muslims. That's the way that that's a racist discourse. The truth is that if you give Palestinians legal rights and the opportunities to live, they are going to, I think, they're going to be no more likely to kill or be killed than any other group of people. Again, you can even just look at the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or you can look at Palestinians around the world. Bill Clinton said he never met a poor Palestinian outside of Palestine. Gaza has as many students in university as the same percentage of students in university as the United Kingdom. The literacy rate is an incredible accomplishment, and largely, partly because of UNRWA, by the way, which we're now defunding, which was staffed entirely by Palestinians. You've got literacy rates of 90-95%, even in these very poor areas. These are not barbarians, and it fills me with rage and shame when I hear people talk in those terms, because I feel like that's the way people talked about us in various times as subhuman, and I just know it's not true. And I don't think that. And once you adopt this racist discourse, you know what ends up happening? You find yourself in league with a whole bunch of other people who have also these kind of racist discourses. So you end up in league with the Viktor Orbáns and Narendra Modis and Donald Trumps of the world. All of these people basically have some supremacist political view, and you become part of that global project.
Now, as I read the many negative responses to Ta-Nehisi Coates' upbraiding of Israel about its treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank, they say he incorrectly imports a racist, non-racist mentality into a situation which is not racial at all. They say this is about people competing for control over land, to be sure, but both of them have a legitimate claim to the homeland status that they seek to implement. And it's not really about race. Why do you say racist? What do you mean?
Look, okay. I mean, if race is a fiction anyway, right? Last time I checked, right? So if you don't want to say racist, say bigoted, right? Yes, Jews are not a race. Jews are an ethno-religious group, right? So that's why I say Jewish supremacy. The supremacy in Israel, it's true, is not based on your skin color. There are black Jews in Israel who have legal superiority over Palestinians who are pretty fair-skinned, who are legally subordinate. So it's not about race, but you have an inherited characteristic, which is, that basically structures what rights you have under the law. That's a system of structural discrimination. It's why even Israel's own human rights organizations like B'Tselem and Yesh Din have said Israel's practicing apartheid. So, people say, Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just importing this American metaphors. First of all, everyone works with metaphor. Everyone works with analogy. We're hardwired to do that. Pro-Israel, so people support Israel are using analogies all the time as well, right? When they compare Iran to the Nazis or Hamas to the Nazis. And it's striking. You don't hear a lot of Palestinians saying Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't know what he's talking about, right? And the truth is, a lot of the dirty little secret is a lot of these people who are, a lot of the people who are Jews who are attacking Ta-Nehisi Coates, they say, oh, he's only been in the West Bank for 10 days. How many times have they been in the West Bank? Most American Jews who go to visit Israel don't go spend time in the West Bank with Palestinians and never have those experiences. And even many, many Israeli Jews, they may do military service there. But in terms of having a human interaction with Palestinians in the West Bank in particular, it very frequently doesn't happen. So I don't believe that it's true that Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't know what he's talking about. I think he learned more in those 10 days than many American and Israeli Jews learn in a lifetime.
There's a theological argument going on, as I understand it, in your book, which I can't evaluate, not having a familiarity with the sources, the Torah and the Jewish moral tradition. But you speak of idolatry. You speak negatively and worriedly about idolatry. What are you talking about there?
I think idolatry is the worship of anything that is human-made, and a state is human-made. And when I think about the relationship the organized American Jewish community and other diaspora Jewish communities have with Israel, it's not just a relationship of support, it's a relationship of worship, because support suggests that there's some external standard against which you are evaluating this state. You support it if it does this, but you stop supporting it if it does that. That's not the way that the organized Jewish community functions vis-a-vis Israel. What happens is, whatever Israel does, you come up with a post to the Palestinians where you come up with a post hoc justification for it. It's self-justifying. So a month ago, if I had said, I think that the mainstream Israeli political leaders, not just Netanyahu, but his political opponents like Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, the centrist opponents, are all going to call for mass expulsion of Palestinians in the West Bank, people would say, how dare you slander Israel that way? And now, when that very thing happens, and we are now, I think, on the precipice of a renewed war, more explicitly geared towards mass expulsion after what Trump said, people justify it in the organized Jewish community. Or they kind of hem and haw and say, well, it's not ideal, but, we need some creative out-of-the-box thinking. We need new paradigms. I mean, this is, and so this is a relationship in which you treat a state as a god. And if you live inside the Jewish community, you see this all the time, because you know that you get in a lot more trouble in many Jewish institutions, most Jewish institutions, for questioning the legitimacy of Israel than of questioning the legitimacy of the Torah, or of questioning the existence of God. And to me, I mean, I don't know, Glenn, you might know more about this than me, because I know you have more of a relationship with Christianity than me. When I look at a lot of white Christians in the United States, they seem to be doing the same thing with America. It's like they've turned America into an idol. If you don't have an American passport, for Donald Trump supporters, you're worthless. You have no value. As far as that's not Christianity's message as I understand it. But this is like, this ethno-nationalism is swallowing a religion.
You say Palestinian liberation and Jewish liberation are intimately connected to one another.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, first of all, I mean, because I believe that Palestinian liberation makes Jews more safe. Because I think and I think there's political science literature to back this up, that divided societies where everyone has a voice in government, even though they can be very messy and dysfunctional, are generally safer than divided societies when one group is locked out of power. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, I just think that and I think that Martin Luther King understood this, and I think Nelson Mandela understood this. There is a psychic burden of being part of a system of oppression when you are in the role of the oppressor. It may not that it divides you from your best self, because you are not your best and truest self when you are constantly having to justify and be part of a system of the degradation of other human beings. And there's a form of after the fact. Sometimes people experience this as liberation from their role as being oppressors. And I see in the Jewish community the way in which I feel like their souls are deformed by their need to constantly be justifying this system of brutal injustice. It doesn't bring out their best qualities. It's almost like I see these people who are good people, thoughtful, kind people. And then when it comes to this, they like sequester all of those, and I think, how can these people who I know are so good, then they see that a hospital has been destroyed and they shrug and they come up with some, transparent human shields talking points. Like, they're sequestering off their best selves. And I think to be able to be in touch with your best self and your true humanity can be a form of liberation.
What do you make of the effort to extirpate pro-Palestinian sentiment being expressed on college campuses under the rubric of fighting anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it's funny, Glenn. There are a whole bunch of people, I won't mention them by name, but who I remember used to talk a lot about how the point at university is to be made uncomfortable. That's a good thing. They didn't like safe spaces. They didn't like snowflakes. They were robust and passionate defenders of free speech, even for ideas that they considered and other people might legitimately consider deeply offensive. And you know what? And they attacked the left for violating those principles. And I think they had a point. I think they were right. And some of those people were prominent Jewish, figures. And now, where are those folks? Now, in the name of protecting the safety of Jewish students, basically, it's become much, much more difficult to protest on a university campus. People are getting fired right and left. Students are getting suspended and expelled because they're chanting slogans that you don't like or that you consider offensive. Well, you know what? The Palestinians feel that the pro-Israel slogans are offensive. They should still be allowed to chant them, right? And this has become part of this larger effort by the administration to basically, attack these universities. It's, to me, it's profoundly, profoundly hypocritical. Jewish students have the right to be safe from violence and intimidation and harassment. They do not have the right to be protected from speech about Israel that makes them really uncomfortable. Being made intellectually and uncomfortable is good at a university. Just like a kid who comes from a deeply anti-abortion, anti-LGBT background and finds it uncomfortable at Brown because they meet a lot of people with a different view. That's education. A lot of these and so it's the same thing for a Jewish kid who comes from a very Zionist environment. But the organized American Jewish community, with the backing of the politicians and these donors, instead of actually recognizing that there's a real debate that should be having, these kids are going to need to have and to listen because they could learn something, right? Instead, their response is to repress this speech and activism. And I think you would know better than, as probably better than me, but I think it's really harming America's universities.
Yeah, I think it is too. And I find it quite ironic because many of the activist students who are protesting on behalf of Palestinian rights are themselves Jewish.
Right. But this is the key point, Glenn, because when you do this move that the Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish leaders do, which is you define being Jewish as being Zionist or being pro-Israel, the flip side of that is that if you're not pro-Israel or you're not Zionist, you're not actually a Jew, right? And so they don't say this out loud, but this is actually the way they function. So when Columbia University suspended Jewish Voice for Peace, right, the first word in that organization's name is Jewish, right? Anti-Defamation League congratulated the president for keeping Jewish students safe, right? So essentially what they're saying is that these Jewish students cease being Jewish because the definition of Jewish is your subscription to an ethno-nationalist project, not actually whether you're not any other more conventional definition of being Jewish. And therefore, yeah, I mean, for the truth, if you look at Germany, which has these very draconian rules about what they call anti-Semitism, the group of people that suffer the most from this are Palestinians. But the second group is Jews. Of the people who have been canceled or disciplined in Germany for anti-Semitic offenses, I think like 25% of those people have been Jews, even though Jews are like 1% of the population in Germany. Right. So this is the irony, right? Is that the dissenting Jews also end up getting repressed and sometimes even beaten up, or because I was, at Dartmouth, when they called the police on campus, which the American Jewish organizations applauded, the police roughed up the former head of the Jewish Studies program. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, and that's keeping Jewish people safe. Well, not that middle-aged Jewish woman who got thrown to the ground by the New Hampshire police didn't keep her safe.
But you don't think that you do think, contrary to what I hear from Jewish advocacy organizations, that anti-Semitism is not on the rise, not only in the United States, but around the world, and they cite chapter and verse.
Well, look, there's a methodological problem, which is that the Anti-Defamation League, which is where people are relying on their data, is a pro-Israel advocacy organization, which is coding as anti-Semitism chants like "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." They're considering that an episode of anti-Semitism. If you look, you're a social scientist, if you look at the social scientists who work on this, and there's particularly a guy at Tufts named Eitan Hirsch, works with a person at Harvard named Laura Roden, they actually find that anti-Semitism is far, far higher on the right. And that anti-Semitism generally tends to travel alongside other bigotries, that the people who don't like Jews tend to not like Muslims and immigrants and Black people and LGBT people. And I think anti-Semitism is on the rise, but the biggest reason it's on the rise is it's part of what comes along with this global ethno-nationalist authoritarian assault on liberal democracy, right? There is anti-Semitism on the left too. It's not as great. In fact, there was a study by the University of Chicago which found that although anti-Zionist sentiment among college students is far higher than it is among Americans as a whole, anti-Semitic attitudes are significantly lower, right? Defined as traditional ways, like are you hostile to Jews as Jews, right? And so I think that the discourse that there's an equal amount of anti-Semitism on the left and the right is wrong. There is some conflation of Jews and Israel on the left, which is a problem, and there's sometimes use of traditional anti-Semitic kind of language, like the Jews control the media or that kind of thing. And there's sometimes a dehumanization of Israelis as just colonizers. And those are problems, but they're really much smaller problems than the problem of the kind of ethno-nationalist right that you're seeing rising in the US and Europe.
So you reject the settler colonialism analogy in reference to Israel?
No, I mean, I don't reject it. I think that it doesn't tell you everything you need to understand about Zionism, but it captures certain truths. And as I point in my book, the early Zionists called themselves colonists all the time. Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, he writes to Cecil Rhodes, and he says, basically, you should support what I'm doing because we're doing something similar. And Said made this point, right? I mean, these are Jews, but they're also Europeans operating at the high watermark of European imperialism in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so they believe they're bringing progress and modernization to a backward part of the world. And that's the way they talk. And they also end up dispossessing the native populations there, the populations that are there, in ways that other settler colonial enterprises do. And people will say, yeah, but that can't be right, because it's, first of all, strange to me that people are so upset about calling Israel settler colonial. They don't seem to have a problem with calling America settler colonial, right? I mean, it's like they ask,
or an apartheid state for that matter.
Yeah, nobody, if you say America was an apartheid state before 1965, or sometimes even if you say it's an apartheid state today, in certain left progressive circles with a lot of Jews, nobody even bats an eye. Like, tell me something I don't know. But then if you say it about Israel, you're an anti-Semite. Like, the settler colonialism doesn't mean that Jews don't have deep roots, profound religious ancient ties to the land. Of course we do. I mean, this is the Babylonian Talmud behind me. Nobody needs to tell me that, right? But just because Jews have profound ancient ties, spiritual ties to the land, doesn't mean Zionism can't also be settler colonial. Cornel West likes to make the point that Liberia was settler colonial. It wasn't because those people didn't have roots in West Africa,
Right.
but they were also Americans who were coming and dispossessed the people who were there and thought they were bringing a superior civilization. Zionism was experienced as a refuge for many Jews who were experiencing anti-Semitism in the Holocaust. There's no question about that, right? Like it was a sense of, it did give Jews an experience of refuge, which was very profound. But that also doesn't mean that it didn't have settler colonial features in the way it treated the Palestinians.
Let me shift a little bit to talking about what U.S. policy should be in the few minutes we have here.
Yeah.
You don't like Trump. I got my questions about Trump. Maybe not as many as you, but, I get it. I get it. And certainly the speculation about cleansing Gaza of the Palestinian population and relocating them to Jordan or Saudi Arabia sounds nutty to me. But it's a pile of rubble with unexploded ordnance everywhere. And as you say, no agriculture, no infrastructure, no hospitals, no universities.
Right. And who made it that way, Glenn?
The guy sitting right next to Trump at the press conference when he was announcing his harebrained scheme.
With our weapons. That ordinance is ours. Those bombs are our bombs.
But what I'm saying is, can you envision rebuilding Gaza?
What I'm going to say will sound beyond the pale and lunatic to many of your friends, but this is what I believe. If Gaza is unlivable, because it's been made unlivable by blockade and by destruction, then the people of Gaza should have the right to go to the place that they would like to live. And the place that they would like to live is what's now Israel, because that's where their families are from, because people from Gaza are not from Gaza. Overwhelmingly, they're the children and grandchildren of people who were forcibly expelled from their homes. And many of them can see those lands from Gaza itself. They're not far away. They can see that they live in an incredibly overcrowded place with very little running water and electricity and no jobs, and that they can see the fertile, relatively much less densely populated areas just beyond Gaza. I believe that they should be able to live equally as equal citizens in the lands, in places in which they used to live. So no, don't send them to Egypt. Don't send them to Albania or Indonesia. Allow them to return to those places. But that requires completely different a reimagining of the state. It requires imagining a state that sees Palestinians as equals to Jews.
Utopian. Never going to happen.
Maybe not. Maybe not. But, other things that were once considered utopian, great movements made them utopian, made them possible. I spent part of my childhood in South Africa. Almost no white South Africans in the 1980s thought that you would have a free election that elected a black man to be president. And within a decade, it happened. And it happened because there was a movement inside the country and outside the country that made the status quo impossible and forced people to think in different ways. And that's what I hope will happen here. I mean, it may not, maybe we'll fail.
Final word.
I mean, I guess I just want to go back to the point that we started with, which is that if this change is going to happen, the conversation needs to be normalized in America. And by what I mean by normalized is people of goodwill need to have the right to see what they're happening with their own eyes and have a conscience and be able to say, I believe this is wrong, right? And they don't need to have a PhD in Jewish studies to say that. They don't need to be able to recite their bar mitzvah portion in order to be able to say that, right? Every great movement in America has brought people of all walks of life, of all different backgrounds. People say they don't know the details of Israel-Palestine. The people who stopped the Vietnam War in America couldn't name you very many geographic locations in Vietnam. They didn't know the deep history of Vietnam. They didn't need to. They could see that American bombs were being used to pulverize an entire group of people, and they said it was wrong. And that's what it's going to take here. And it's going to take people having the courage, even if some of their Jewish friends don't like it, and even if some people call them anti-Semitic, to trust what they know is right. And all this, I just wish every single person who sees what's happening and knows it's not right would have the courage to speak about it. And my role as a Jewish person is to try to help that process.
Yeah, well, I'll just say humbly, I've done my part. I've tried to do my part. And it's not without its cost, but we're going to keep the faith here. My guest has been Peter Beinart. His book is called Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Glenn.